Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
The Winchester Powerhouse presents portraits of the Winchester bishops down to the Norman conquest. It's the first volume of a study covering the lives of some 100 holders of the highest ecclesiastical office. Delighted to say that the man behind the Winchester Powerhouse, Anthony Paice, joins me live on the line now. Anthony, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us. Just explain those for those who are coming, if you like, at this with a blank sheet. What time period we're talking about and the importance of Winchester in the world we're talking about.
Right. We're talking from 634 AD to 1070, which is the period when the Anglo-Saxons were you can say in power, because they were a very strong spiritual force. And they worked very closely with the Wessex kings, who eventually became the kings of England. And really, there was a symbiotic relationship between the royals and the spirituals, which created a benevolent and very strong society. Indeed, you could say that Wessex would not have survived but for the glue of the church, which kept it going in the parishes. Yep.
And of course, I suppose the thing is we're looking at the reaffirmation or the shoring up or the strengthening of Christianity during this period, because obviously we've funded into what's being called misnamed as the Dark Ages, which is I can't stand, that gets my goat all the time. But also, we're looking at invasions coming across from obviously Viking stroke Denmark, all the stuff that is going on there as well. So this is a constant that people can sort of cling to, and this is what keeps the bishops of Winchester sort of, if you like, keeps them current and it keeps them relevant. I suppose that's what I'm looking for.
Yes. Well, Giles, as you know, St. Augustine arrived in Kent right at the end of the 6th century. Are we talking? Yes. And he set up shop in Canterbury. And he had a couple of extra dioceses, one in Rochester and the other in London. But very quickly, they lost London because the pagans came over from Mercia and took that over. And Rochester's never been very large. And that's it. Up north, the Irish were sending over people to convert York and Northumbria and so on, but didn't get that far. So there was nothing in southern England. And then suddenly a man called Berin, who was a Frank, came over with a group of followers and set up a shop in the south. He would have made a close relationship with the king of the time, Kinegils. They went up and they baptized, or King of Kinegils was baptized by a northerner. What started then was this strong relationship with the Wessex royal family. It prospered. The bishop, as he became, supported the king. King really enjoyed that and handed out a large amount of land, which strengthened the church. The bishop, on his part, acted as a chief counselor, advisor, because he could speak Latin and he could write. And gradually, Winchester becomes the center of an educational forcing house. Well, they weren't monks, actually. The clerks who were in Winchester Minster, it wasn't a cathedral at the time, they were educated. They could staff out chanceries. And by the 10th century, Winchester bishops were chancellors, basically, the first chancellors of England, right the way through to the conquest. And as you will know, throughout the 10th century, after the Danes had been defeated, and who was it who defeated it but Alfred the Great, the only Brit who's ever been called great. And he did so when the rest of the country had been completely taken over by the Danes. Why did Wessex stay independent and indeed able to fight back? It was because it had this strong Christian stroke Episcopal force behind it. There was a parish structure, and so when you needed to have the chaps there to fight in the shield wall, the ponies went out with their messengers on board to the local villages and so on, and the local priest said, right, chaps, off to fight. And they did. And that's the way it worked.
You see, this is the thing that intrigued me, because this is the beginning of the relationship that we will see between church and between monarchy and church through basically, you could say up until the early 20th century, if you like, because you have, especially in this period of time, and from this early Middle Ages, there you go, not Dark Ages, time, to be the king of Wessex or whatever. If you are a medieval king, your job is to basically keep your eye on the family plus the baron or whoever else is trying to take a pop at you. And so, life is brutish and short, and you have to be pretty brutish and short yourself to get through it. So you haven't got time to be doing the diplomatic thing, to be writing stuff, to be sending entreaters to. And I'm interested with the Franks coming over, because that maybe is the start of that whole Anglo-French relationship that we'll see going all the way to Aquitaine and what happens with the Plantagenets. But if you are a fighting king, which you are in the Middle Ages, you need somebody to keep your eye on the structure and do diplomatic stuff, and also be able to write pretty prose when it comes to it.
Well, absolutely, Giles. And what actually happened was that the king and the bishop formed the legal system in which the king's representative and the bishop sat in the court together, and together meted out whatever sentences had to be meted out. And so there would be a fine, perhaps, or imprisonment, or what have you. Where you paid your fine, the king was happy. But if you continued to misbehave, the bishop was there to say, naughty boy, God doesn't like you for that. And in those days, of course, the fear of what happened to you after death was much greater than it probably is today. This changed after the conquest, because the bishops, instead of having an equal relationship with the secular side, were relegated. They were no longer just, they were called earls, which means they are beneath the king, not equal to the king in power. And this caused a great deal of trouble post-conquest, because kings and bishops were always quarrelling over who should try whom. Thomas à Becket is a case in point with the criminous clerks, when Becket was saying you cannot try a clergyman. And that doesn't mean just somebody who's got a dog collar on. It means somebody who's just decided, I think I might one day like to become a priest, but I'll start off by being,
this is the thing. The second son was always pelted, wasn't he? He was always normal. Or the third was always ended up in the clergy. And obviously, if you find yourself in a bit of bother, then what you can do one of two things. Either you can go and take the cross and head off towards Jerusalem, exactly, or you can suddenly start making donations and become, if you like, de facto involved with church. And that does bring up huge church v state, which we have been seeing ever since.
Absolutely, yeah. So anyway, for me, I'm born and bred in Winchester, a very young lad. I used to visit the cathedral and see all these dead men lying on their tombs. And it fascinated me, and it continued to fascinate me because I could see that my small city, because Winchester is not exactly a Manchester, had this huge prominence in the Middle Ages, which lasted way down past the Reformation. Why? And the answer is basically power, that the church had really advanced from the south, not from the north, not from Canterbury. It was Winchester. And the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1066, and who died in 1070, was a man called Stigand.
Yeah.
He was before that Bishop of Winchester, and he held Winchester even while he was Archbishop of Canterbury.
Winchester makes sense though because of its geographically as well, doesn't it? Obviously, because it is a little bit easier to get to, if you like, than being flung out in Canterbury. It makes sense as a seat of power.
It does. And, well, of course, if the Wessex kings use Winchester as their capital, that's where they put their treasury. And where the treasury is normally where the capital is. And Winchester loses its status as capital of England when the treasury moves from Winchester to the Tower of London.
How did I know this? I'll go back to the Saxons in a minute, but how does the church handle having William come over, defeat the Saxon army? After William in turn has defeated the Vikings' armies. I mean, this obviously shakes things up quite considerably. And you mentioned sort of a Frank coming over. And for those who don't know, obviously the Frankish area isn't France per se, because that doesn't really exist. I mean, it is an area, and it also, I suppose, it is the description of what will be sort of the powerhouse type of people for the next 4 centuries.
Yes. Well, the Frank is the person who takes over Paris eventually. I mean, you can say the Franks are between the Rhine and Paris, basically. Yeah. So the early Winchester bishops would have taken their orders from the Archbishop in Paris, rather than from the Archbishop in Canterbury. There's a very good reason for there not being much contact between Canterbury and Winchester in the very early years, and it was largely because there was a huge great forest in between, and a natural barrier, if you like. Similarly, I mean, people say, well, why didn't Canterbury move up into London? Well, there was a rather important pagan called Penda who rather disliked Christians and had them for breakfast. So, it's a completely different route of conversion. Augustine goes over the shortest route, Dover-wise, and that's why he lands in Canterbury. Berin, or Birinus, as he's also called, he comes down the Seine and crosses over via the Isle of Wight and lands basically in Southampton. I mean, I think I know where he did land, which is a place called Stokes Bay near Gosport in southeast Hampshire. And I've got a good idea of how he then moved further up to Southampton. You just got to know the winds and tides and how they work. And once he got to Southampton, he said, well, who's the important man to talk to? And the man, of course, would have been the King of Wessex at the time. He already was a king. His name was Kinegals, but he was still unconverted. But he did have women in his household who, rather like the Kentish experience with St. Augustine, suggested it might be a good idea, Dad or husband, if you joined up with this, because there is the possibility of going to heaven rather than to hell. That's quite an attraction in those days. I mean, it's all this a bit colloquial, Giles, but it's human. It's what happens in life, and it's one of the things that I've had to deal with in writing this book. Is given the paucity of sources, and that's why it's called Dark Ages, because people don't know. You've got to analyze what you can find. There are sources. Mostly, actually, the things that do survive are documents to do with property. Because you always have documents when you are trading property. And that's where the names show up, the amount of gifting that's been going on. But you then have to go beyond that and think, well, now what really would have happened? Now, I'll give you a good example. Beren turns up and he apparently forgets something in the boat that's just delivered him.
Right.
So he wades back to the boat to pick this up, and he's wearing white. You can imagine what he would have been wearing. Very simple, long toga-like. What does that white cloth do when it gets into the sea? It floats up, doesn't it?
Yes.
So the legend is, of course, he was seen walking on the water.
Ah, okay.
Go back to the New Testament. What does Christ do? He walks on the water. So you put these things together and you can see how people's imaginations are fired up. So he immediately gets saintly qualities.
just from waiting, because you left something on the boat. I mean, that was my next question, because I mean, obviously, getting sources. I mean, you're not going to get primary sources, are you? You're not going to get sort of diary of a Saxon maiden.
No.
So, and you've worked in intelligence. I imagine this was quite a challenge for you to begin with, and also but it gives you that creativity not creativity, but you know what I mean, it's sort of reimagine, because we tend to
lateral thinking,
exactly, because we tend to think it's all very boring and dusty, and it must have been, but you know, as always, I mean, there's this creativity. There's enough going on to make Game of Thrones look like Play School, for goodness sake. So, you know.
Yes, yeah, and I'm glad you raised the question of intelligence, because, as you know, last year I wrote a book and had it published, Overkill or Underkill, and you very kindly talked to me about that. But some of the tools of the trade should be used by an author. To work out what would have happened, what people would have done in those circumstances. And then, again, to look at geography and see why something couldn't happen. And this is back to forests and mountains and so on. They get in the way. And that stops people from advancing or liaising with one another. So, yeah, I was very fortunate in that I had years when I couldn't write about things that I wrote about last year, but I could write about something completely different, but use perhaps some of the same techniques.
I know we're looking at a period now that is, over 1,000 years ago now, but how much of when you walk around Winchester, a town that you have known very obviously through your life, I mean, has this given you a new appraisal for Winchester itself?
Yes, I think so. But little things, Giles. For example, Winchester. What does the name mean? Well, some people say, it's something to do with the word white. And why would they say that? Well, because of the chalk cliffs around. And there's chalk cliffs around. But it's nothing to do with that. it's the other thing that used to come out. Primary school teachers, including my father, actually used to say, "Oh, the reason why it's called Winchester is because it's a corruption of Witan Castor." Well, the Castor bit you can get because that's Roman castle.
Yeah.
But Witan, of course, was the advisory council for the king. And it was based in Winchester. No, it wasn't. It went all over the place. It was peripatetic, I think is the
where
right
the king
word.
was, it was there, wasn't it, basically?
That's right.
Yeah.
It's nothing to do with the name. No, it's very simple. Venter Belgarum is the Roman name. Venter and winter are not very far apart, and that's what it means basically. And it's the castle of the Belgae, which was Venter Belgarum. So you work on that sort of thing. But back to what you were saying about, you look from the West Gate, top of the West Gate, down the hill, and all you see actually is an 18th century town. But actually, Winchester is the original 4-street town, one going west down to east and the other going south across to north. And that's Saxon.
Yeah.
That is Saxon. And there would have been walls of a sort. Nothing like the Norman walls.
No. It would have been embankment. It would have been
it would be yes, a palisade on top of.
Yes. We're both making gestures at each other here, by the way, listeners. So we're getting. What do you hope that people are going to take from the Winchester Powerhouse, Anthony? What do you hope people will learn?
What are they going to take from it?
What do you hope people will learn from it?
Well, first of all, that they do have a Saxon heritage, which defined their laws. Indeed, the age of criminal responsibility was first laid down in the 8th century by Saxon bishops, basically.
It begs the question then, in Saxon times, were people running around with various weapons on them? Well, what is the age of, if you're a Saxon, what is the age of criminal responsibility then?
It's a good question. The question has gone out of my mind, but it's no older than, it's about 13.
Okay, all right. So fair enough.
It's being quite intelligent. And I would say that Saxon society was actually far more benevolent than Norman society. The Normans come in and they bring in feudalism and militarism, and they knock everything down.
Yes,
I mean the Saxons put up 2 glorious buildings where the Winchester Cathedral is today. Both of them were knocked down. Why? Because we're Normanizing everything. But then here's the thing: 14th century. The west end of Winchester Cathedral falls down. So it has to be rebuilt by Bishop Eddington, in fact. And when it's put up, and it's really rather a splendid looking bit of the building, right at the top, the pinnacle, is a statue. Now, the statue is not of a Norman or of Peter and Paul, who were the other patron saints for the cathedral. Swithin, famous Saxon saint and bishop. So in the 14th century, the English culture has got back in charge, as it were. And, Normans were only a veneer, a rather brutal veneer, and they did things that no Anglo-Saxon bishop would have done. Take burning people. One of the biggest burners was a chap called Gardner, Bishop Gardner, in the 16th century, under Mary. No Saxon bishop would have contemplated doing that sort of thing. They just didn't do it.
But as you said, the Normans, and this isn't the frame, but the Normans especially are militaristic. They get all the way to Sicily, for goodness sake. Yep. They call, and then some. And they introduce this feudal system, which is completely different from the system that we outlined before, the Saxon system, because it is highly militaristic. And is basically to help fuel their armies, basically.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the Normans put up castles to defend themselves.
Yeah.
What did Alfred the Great do? He invented boroughs, or burhs, which were fortified areas, not just for a few chaps in armour, but for the whole population. That's the difference. It's a proper society as opposed to a military society protecting the few.
Because the Normans are always worried that the population is going to rise up, and so that's why they have citadels, and that's why you have the White Tower and from the Tower of London, etc., etc.
Yeah.
I could talk to you, as you can say, Anthony, for this until probably doomsday. And Chaucer's The Winchester Tales has a ring to it, doesn't it, rather than the Canterbury Tales, I think. But there you go. Well, that's one of the great what-ifs. The book is called The Winchester Powerhouse. It is a portrait of the Winchester bishops down to the Norman Conquest. It's by Anthony Paice, who is speaking to today. Anthony, if people want to find you online, do you do the website thing? Can people find you that way?
Well, they can find me. Yes, of course they can. Absolutely. They just have to Google me, that's all.
And you'll pop up in the most unusual places. The book is called The Winchester Powerhouse. It's by Anthony Paice, who we've been speaking to today. You can order it via our own virtual bookstore as well, just in time for Christmas. Once again, Anthony, it's been a real pleasure to speak to you today.
Well, thanks for being there.